Great. Thank you, Jenny. So welcome everyone again to our monthly Lunch and Learn. Our first one for this year, so for 2024, and it is on Zoom. Our remaining ones that we have are are scheduled each month, but in person, and I'll be going and showing you where you can find our in-person workshops if you actually want to see more hands-on the process. This Lunch and Learn is just going to explain the science behind composting and also have an ability to answer any specific questions that you might be having some troubleshooting. But like I said, if you're new to composting, the best way to actually learn it also is to not only take this knowledge that I'm going to share with today, but then actually go and apply it and actually look at it in person. And then typically when you do that, everything kind of comes together. So I encourage you to also attend one of our in-person workshops coming up. So we'll get started. There are different ways of managing plant and food scraps in Thurston County. And specifically for today's presentation, we're going to focus in on what you can do at your residence. But there's two other options that are also available for folks. Curbside pickup. This is where, again, whoever your hauler is, you would contact them that you want to add organics collection as part of your services. There is for organics an additional fee that you would pay on a monthly basis, but that's where you would have a cart specifically for organics. Organics does include food scraps as well as plant material like yard debris. Food scraps, there is a little bit more, there are certain foods that can and can't go in there, and then we'll also share with you where you can also find that list if this is something that you're more interested in rather than actually composting it yourself at home. The other way is to haul it yourself over to the Thurston County Waste and Recovery Center in Hawks Prairie, and that's also where you can drop off organics materials there as well. And there is a fee that goes with that. That you go across the scales, they'll weigh your car, and then you go dump your material, and then in the way out, they weigh you again, and then you pay for the difference there. And all of that is on the Thurston County Solid Waste website that will give you all of the fees and also the times when they're open. So for today's, the other thing too, it's only an hour Lunch and Learn, and composting can, again, sometimes it takes a little bit longer than that. So we did do a longer webinar back in 2021. It is on our YouTube channel. The recording of that is, you can just even put in YouTube, and you can just put in Master Recycler Composter program, and all of a sudden you'll see which videos we have currently on our channel there. And also we have the link on our website too, so you can get to it either way. And that goes into a little bit more detail about the science behind some of these practices. But for today, we're just going to try to, again, need to keep it within this hour-long presentation. So what is compost? If we're talking about all the different types of compost, sometimes compost gets mixed in with mulches, or it's a soil. But the definition from the dictionary is actually composting is simply a combination of yard debris like grass clippings and fallen leaves and or kitchen scraps such as fruit and vegetable spoils. So the parts of the fruits and vegetables that you don't actually eat, separated from the waste stream to be placed in an environment that's suitable for decomposition. As a result, it is used in order to fertilize the soil. And those are sometimes called an amendment. And by amending the soil is by adding nutrients into the soil via compost. The one thing I will say with composting, it is a variable process, meaning it is part science, but it is also part art. And if you think about compost kind of like a recipe, every single time you make a certain recipe, it might change a little. Even if you have the exact recipe and you measure it out, sometimes, again, the moisture content or humidity or other things like that can also play a factor in that particular recipe. And so that's kind of what compost is. Sometimes you'll end up having more moisture. Other times it's a little bit drier. Sometimes you're going to have different percentages of food scraps in there compared to yard debris. So it is, there are some basic principles to compost, but just know that it is like a recipe. It's like, it's a combination of art and science. And I'm going to give you some of the tools in order to figure out how best to navigate those differences. Before you begin, you need to ask yourself 3 questions. Specifically, number 1 is, how much space do you have? There are very different types of composting systems, and it's all based on how much space you have. Do you have a single family residence? Do you have acreage, or do you live in an apartment or a high-rise building? All of these spaces does allow for compost. It's just different types of systems. And so that's what we're going to go through here in just a few minutes. The other question you need to ask is, how much waste do you have? And so in this circumstance, you'd have to figure out whether or not, again, you have 1 or 2 people in your household. Do you have a family of 5, 6 people in your household, 2 people in your household? That will also determine which is the best composting system to have that you're going to implement into your system. You also need to evaluate what materials would you like to compost at home. If you're looking, the one thing I kind of do is always evaluate before you begin, or even if you already are using a system, there might be other things that you could actually add to that. And that would be one of the things where you would evaluate what other materials are you looking to remove from your trash. Meaning this is materials that could be composted, but currently you are putting into the trash system. And so what other things could we be diverting? And I'm going to show you a list here in just a minute. So what can you compost at home? Here's a short list of some of the major category headings in which you can compost. So it's fruit and vegetable matter, yard debris like leaves, sticks, things of that nature, lawn clippings. The one thing I will say that if you want to have your finished compost, like when you're done with the composting process and you actually have the final product, if you are going to put this on your vegetable beds, I would not put lawn clippings that had been treated but with a weed and feed. Some of those pesticide residues take longer to break down. And so that is one of the things where if you know that you're going to put that finished compost on your vegetable crops, I would not be putting lawn clippings into that without letting it compost and cook a lot longer than traditional timing. Some other things include certain paper products, napkins, paper plates that are uncoated are all acceptable that you can put in your home composting system. Things that have a lot of waxy surfaces on it are things that we want to try to avoid in putting in your system. Sawdust a little bit is fine. Too much can actually stall your pile, so you kind of have to have the right ratio for that. Wood chips are fine. They're also used as a bulking agent. Eggshells, a little bit is fine. They don't have to be, it's best to break them down, but they don't have to be pulverized like we've seen sometimes on the internet. Coffee grounds and filters are fine, tea bags, and some manures. And we'll get through manures here in just a bit. So what are some things that we can't compost at home? So here's the short list of some of the bigger headings there. So this is number 1, hazardous waste or trash. Things that obviously aren't going to be breaking down in a backyard system. Meats, oils, dairies, and food waste. With this, if you look at those items there, all of those items have a higher fat content. And that's one of the things that actually acts as a barrier for our microorganisms that are actually doing the breaking down of the food scraps. So if I had, let's say, a salad, but I covered it in ranch dressing, that bacteria that's trying to break through that to actually start to decompose that lettuce leaf is having a difficult time because of the oil and the fat layer in that ranch dressing. So a little bit of dressing's fine, but if you had like a giant party and all of a sudden you had a whole ton of salad that wasn't left, that was all covered and it just was not there, I would not be putting that in my home system. What ends up happening is that food ends up going rancid before the bacteria can actually process that. And then that's where you end up having smells and other issues as being one of the major concerns. So we want to try to avoid meats, oils, dairy, and food waste in a home system. Now, some of those items can also be put in your curbside organics. If you had collection and if you had a cart that had your organics bin, you could put some of those meats and oil based foods in that system, is because that system goes to a commercial facility, which those at a commercial facility, the temperatures of those compost piles are astronomical higher than what you would get in a home system. So those are the two differences where if you're wondering why all of a sudden if I got curbside recycling, I could put my meats and ranch covered dressing salad in that bin, but I can't do it in my home system. That's the difference. Our home systems do not get up to the same temperatures as a commercial facility does. Don't want to put anything food that's spoiled with any potential pathogens, meaning a dented can that's been in your cupboard for years and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I don't know, it's already expired. It's been in there for, a long time, and sure enough, it's got dents and cans. I would not be putting anything also that has a potential pathogen into my compost pile. Certain weeds are fine. There are other weeds we know that are more prolific, and so we want to make sure we avoid having those. And also, as a general rule, try to get the weeds in there before they've gone to seed, meaning before they've actually set their seeds out. We want to make sure that if you've done your weeding, those potentially can go into your compost pile just fine. If you put seeds, weeds that have already gone to seed, that means those seeds are now part of your compost. And so not all of the weed seeds will be killed. And so then what you end up having is that in your finished compost, you have those seeds that are now interspersed with all the rest of the composting material. And then you spread that all over your landscape. And now you've just added those weed seeds everywhere else in your yard. So as a general rule, it's best to get the weeds in your compost pile before the seeds have actually been produced on the plant. Try to, just for safety's sake, you want to try to avoid anything that's super thorny. It has, large prickles on it. In the commercial facility, some of those are fine, others are not. For example, even in a commercial facility, they don't want blackberry in their system. So yeah, so those are definitely not good for a home system, and that's just for safety's sake. And also they just take longer to decompose. But it's not to say you couldn't put some in there, just you have to have the right ratios. Limited citrus and cedar, those two products there are natural antibacteria killers. And as a composter, we want to actually be a bacteria farmer. And so, which means that we want to encourage bacteria in our compost pile. And so by adding a ton of citrus and cedar products, you're actually killing off the bacteria that actually are breaking down the food scraps. So a little bit of citrus and cedar is fine. But like I said, if you had a giant party and you had a ton of orange peels in there, I would be spacing them out or not put all of them into your compost pile. Treated, painted, or painted wood is also something you want to avoid. It's hard for the bacteria to get past those layers. Plastics or bioplastics. This is, I think, the most challenging category right now, because so many things that are packaged are now giving us a suggestion of how to actually process them, meaning, should this go in the trash? Should this go in the compost pile? The problem is that when these items are produced, they are produced in other areas of the country where they have different composting systems in place. And so some of the stuff that they say is recyclable, or yes, I could put this into my pile, is actually not something that is done here in our county. Or even within the state of Washington, there's variances between each county on how things are processed. And so that can be a little bit challenging for the consumer, because you're looking at this item that says, put me in my compost pile. But in fact, that isn't something necessarily that you want to put in your pile here locally. Okay, so that we've done that. Some barbecue ash is fine. If you put too much in, it just stalls your pile. Liquids, again, are fine. In the beginning, you need a little bit of extra water to get your pile started. After that, you just need to make sure that it's the right moisture content. Dirt and soil, I add a little bit when I'm building a new pile into that new pile, just to make sure that the right microorganisms are in there. And with pet manures, I would say the number one that you do want to encourage in there of use is chicken, alpaca, and rabbit are all great manures. They're kind of the ones that burn the hottest. The other ones next would be cow and horse. Those are also good, but the only thing with that, they burn a little less hot. And that's the reason why, is because typically when you get the manures from there, there's also the bedding that comes with it. It's very difficult to separate cow and horse manure from the bedding that actually is within their habitat, their enclosures. The ones we want to avoid completely by not putting in your home system is dog, cat, and pig. Those are the three manures you never want to put in a home system. They carry different pathogens that aren't necessarily broken down in a home system. Commercial system, completely different, but in a home system, those three are not encouraged as far as to be putting in a home system. All right, so those are some of the major categories about what you can and can't put in your pile. The last thing I will reiterate is that if you have a bunch of diseased plant material, this is one of the areas where you're going to have to decide if you actually should put it into your pile or not. There are certain pathogens and diseases that you don't want to put in. So as a general rule, if you have a very diseased plant there, it's probably not best to put it in your pile because you're not sure necessarily if the temperature of your pile will actually kill off the pathogens within that diseased plant. So ultimately, you have to think about when you're processing compost, the end goal is to have a finished nutrient-based amendment to add those nutrients back to your soil. We don't want to introduce diseases in that process to those plants that are actually relatively healthy or don't even have disease on it at all. Okay, so our first question break. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature. Again, it's typically on most screens, it's a black bar that's at the bottom of your screen and it says Q&A. At that point, you can just type in a question and then Jenny will be able to take a look at it.
We don't have any questions right now.
Okay, great. We'll keep moving then. All right, so let's look at the actual process of composting. So the composting process, if you were to look at it like a car, there's traditionally two parts that have to happen for compost to happen. And then we add a third part to actually speed the process up. So the two parts that are consistent, if you want compost to happen, you need to have the microherd, which is what in comparison to like a car, it would be considered the engine. The microherd includes bacteria, fungi, worms, and arthropods, which are otherwise known as bugs. And those are critical for processing what we call the organic waste or in this case for the car, would otherwise known as the fuel. So those two things need to be hand in hand, meaning the engine needs fuel for it to run. And so those bacteria and fungi are processing the organic waste. And so they're ones that are actually doing the breaking down process. The worms come behind and actually eat the bacteria and fungi. And as they finish out the rest of the food scraps from there. So those things are required for composting to happen. If you want to speed up the process, then you yourself can insert you into that process by helping your pile process a little bit quicker. And so that's why as the operator of the car, that means you have the ability to help this composting process speed up if you want faster results, but it does take a few steps for that to happen. If you don't have yourself into the mix, compost naturally happens. It will happen. And it will happen traditionally within 2 years. Anything that you originally started in a pile will have naturally broken down within that 2-year time frame. If you don't want to wait 2 years, you can get finished compost between 4 and 6 months traditionally, and then a little bit of time to cure it after that. So a few weeks. So within perspective, you can really speed up the process by actually incorporating into what's called a hot system. So today, we're going to cover the cold and hot systems. They're also known as passive or active systems. There's also another process called vermicomposting, which is composting via worms. We have in-person workshops about that scheduled throughout the rest of the year. And another system called bokashi composting. That process uses your food scraps, but with bokashi, you actually want to take out all of the oxygen in that decomposition process. And it's more a composting via fermentation rather than the active and the passive systems, which you need oxygen in order for those systems to work. So it's just a different method, but these are all examples of traditional processes of composting. So if we're going to focus on for the rest of our talk today, just on the two systems, one being cold, that again is easy because you literally just throw the stuff on a pile and you come back 2 years later and the stuff will have broken down into a finished compost. So it does tend to cost less because again, you're just throwing it into a pile, requires less work because you're not actively processing or turning or anything with that pile. You're just letting it let it sit there. But once you actually set up the pile, you don't really do anything else other than that. And so this is traditionally what we're talking about in having like a passive system, just like literally you throw your stuff on a pile, and then 2 years, the center section of this here underneath this will be, again, a finished compost that you can use as an amendment. So cold up to 2 years is better for yard waste, not so much food waste, because if you look at that pile, if I had food scraps right on there, that means all the rodents would also be part of that system, which probably is not something you want. You're not restricted by the pile size, and yes, the diversity of organisms moving in and out of the pile is quite large because, again, it has a lot of land contact from there. And the only downside, another thing with this particular is that some weed seeds will still survive because that pile does not heat up as hot as some of the hot systems. So that's what's called cold or slow composting. And that's, again, the pile here. All right, so now we're going to compare that to the active or hot system. So that the difference is U plus turning of the compost pile plus moisture increases the rate of decomposition. So let's review that again. You inserting yourself into the composting process by turning it and adding the right moisture content will actually help speed up the decomposition process and help it break down faster so that you could get a finished compost, again, within that 4 to 6 month time frame. Typically, they're done by using a bin. And they don't have to be plastic. There's lots of different types of bins, but these are some of the more traditional or common ones that you see as a way to help process your compost. Ultimately, these bins, that if you do choose to use a bin, they're already set up in the correct dimensions of 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. So science has proven that that particular size, the 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, is a good size for having the right balance, or remember, as we talked about earlier, the right recipe in making sure that we have that right balance so that we get a good finished process, or I'm sorry, good finished compost. With these types of hot systems, you do need to turn the compost, meaning you do have to actively be out there making sure that the right water content and moisture content of that pile, and by adding air to that pile. Otherwise, your pile will stall and it'll end up going back, reverting to more of a cold system where, again, the process just is slower. So with the hot system, typically you will get temperatures over 140 degrees, which will kill off some weed seeds, but not all. At some point, though, just keep in mind that you never want to get your pile over 180 degrees. That is the maximum temperature that for any home system that is acceptable. So ultimately, when you first mix a pile, the temperatures will rise, but you want to make sure that they don't go above 180. So by putting the right items in your pile, we'll make sure that you don't go over 180 degrees. The other thing is, if you do go over that, you're going to end up temperature-wise, you're going to kill off some of the beneficial organisms, which you need them in order to process your food scraps. So you want to make sure that you keep as many good bacteria and fungi in that pile. So with a container, do you need one? No, you could use, again, the cold system and just put it in a pile. And like I said, as long as you have space, a pile system just works fine. But if you do want to speed that up, a container can be helpful. And there's lots of different bin styles from all different types. So they have, like, these are called earth machines, which are a little bit more enclosed, and they help process. The one in the center here, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. Right here in the center, this is one called an earth machine, and it's better for food scraps just because it keeps things a little bit more enclosed compared to the other two bottom ones, which have more slats and holes, which allows great for oxygen, but it also allows for all the critters also to come in there too. So the bottom one there is a biostack machine. Biostack, and that one is also good for yard waste, yard debris too, just like the one on the right picture as well. The tumblers are also another type that's very popular right now. That is one style of bin that we currently do not recommend, just because it's a little bit trickier in order to keep the right ratio of everything that you need in order for compost to happen. The tumblers have no soil contact. So you have to be the one to be the monitor of the right ratios. And that can be a little bit tricky when you're trying to make sure that you have enough of your micro herd in there, along with moisture content, and that you don't overfill it so that you actually can still turn the bin. A couple other ones are these wire mesh ones or a pallet system. These are also another great option for having a bin style. Or again, you don't need one, and there's just the heap that you can, a pile that you just throw things in again in. But the only downside with that is that you need to actually have enough space to actually have one of those, and not everybody has space enough for that to happen. So bins can actually be helpful in that for those that don't have a lot of outdoor space. We did put together on our website a pro and con handout that lists the pros and cons of all the different bin styles that I just showed you there, and some others. So if you go to our website, just which we'll share with you at the end of this presentation, and also you'll get a follow-up email from us that'll have that resource there. You can see again the handout, and it'll have all the different bin styles, and it says the pros and cons of each of those bins. Yeah, so if you have any questions about that, check the handout, and then also you can email us directly if you have any specific questions that we can help you decide which bin would be work best for you. All right, we're at questions.
We do have a question.
Okay.
The question is, can I put wet leaves from my yard in the compost pile? Would they possibly introduce slug eggs into my compost?
Potentially, yes. In fact, when we get to that slide, I'm going to show you what slug eggs look like. I do have a slide of that coming up here. So if you're not sure what they look like, you could put your leaves in, but I would probably fluff them as I go. I wouldn't just put giant heaps of them to see if you can kind of process out anything that shouldn't necessarily be in the pile. Wet leaves are fine. They just know that if they're wet leaves, that means that moisture is going to be higher. So you're going to probably have to have a drier bulking agent to kind of balance them being wet. Again, the moisture content is really critical, having that right ratio, and we're moving into those slides right now, into that section of the presentation.
Okay, and then another question came in. How do I take the compost temperature?
So there is a thing called a composting thermometer. It is think about like a thermometer that we would use for cooking, or like to take our own temperature. Think about that, but add another probably a foot and a half to it. So you can buy them online. They're called a composting thermometer, and that is the best way to actually be able to test the different depths of your compost pile to know whether or not what temperatures you are reaching.
And does compost starter help?
Compost starter is one of those things where there's mixed reviews on the use of that. As far as our program, we encourage you to use again a couple handfuls of soil that's typically out in your landscape that can provide enough bacteria and fungi in order to get your pile started. If you buy it commercially, there are different types of bacteria that are in there, and with us, we encouraged you to use our native bacteria that is naturally found in your yard as a way to kickstart your pile. So traditionally, we haven't recommended starters as being necessary, but there is on the internet, there is definitely mixed reviews on whether the effectiveness of those are truly effective.
And a follow-up question to the wet leaves. Would the wet leaves be considered a brown?
Yes, but more of a mixed between a green and a brown because of the moisture content. So so when we're getting to the ratio coming up here right now, that's where you're going to it's going to be, traditionally leaves are considered browns, but if they're wet, they're going to act like more of a green too. So you have to, because of the moisture. So your ratios, you're going to have to watch them to make sure that you're not putting too much water or moisture content in your pile. So.
And that's it for the questions right now.
Okay. Great. All right, so here we are. Time to build the compost pile. So number one, location. If you don't already have a location, some things that you need to think about is where you're going to build your pile. You want to have it accessible, but you're not going to have it right in the same spaces that you would typically be, let's say, entertaining. Okay, so you don't want to have it like right next to your deck or in that space, but you want to have it be accessible so that it's not so far in your yard that you're not going to want to actually go out there and use it. Specifically, if you're doing food compost and in the wintertime, when it's wet, cold, or snowy, or whatever else is going on, if it's, at the way back of your, 5-acre property there, are you really going to take your little bucket of food scraps and haul it out there every single time you do it? So you want to kind of, again, pick and choose where you're going to do that based on accessibility, but also not having it be, right in front of, let's say, again, your deck or your patio where you'd be hanging out. Okay. Behind the fence is fine. On your deck, obviously, for those that live in smaller spaces, you can compost via worm composting on a deck or on a porch using a smaller bin. So that is done, but typically a yard waste system, you're not going to be putting on your deck or close, by your house. Worm composting can also be done inside your home via a bin. And so that, again, we'll cover in a different workshop. But if you're interested in, again, small space composting, there are options for you on using worms as a way to process your compost. The number one thing that I will say is that if you buy a bin, typically they have a liner that comes with. Those are the things that we encourage you not to use. And that ultimately you want to have that bin have soil contact, meaning the bottom should be open to the ground so that those microbes can easily move in and out of the pile from what materials are in your pile to what is actually in the ground. And so some of those systems that I showed you earlier have this plastic base that would come with it. And we encourage you not to use those and to have that soil contact so those microorganisms can move easily through the bin. So for example, this one did not come with the bin. This one's called a geo bin. It's got a bunch of air holes through here. This one's open to the ground. So here, if you can again see my cursor here, you can see that this is touching the ground here. So all the microbes that are in the ground are freely able to be moving in and out of the pile from there. We do have a video on our YouTube channel that goes through all the different tools that you may use. For today's Lunch and Learn, I can't go through every single part of the composting process as in depth. And so that's why we created these additional videos for you to check out. We go through all the different types of tools that you potentially might need and also what's required. Number one, I would say hands down is gloves. Always wear gloves when you're working with your compost. You're dealing with, again, bacteria and fungus. And so you want to make sure that you're protecting yourself there. And there are potential pathogens that can also happen in your compost pile. And so you want to make sure that you're, again, protecting yourself from that by wearing gloves. Also having the right tools, some kind of pruner or snips from there. A small handsaw is also helpful especially for breaking down larger branches in that. And a thermometer is also helpful. And I don't see it in this one, but I know on our YouTube video, I do showcase the composting thermometer in that video there. A wheelbarrow, a tarp, and then eventually at the end, some way that you can sift the compost and your finished compost, which we'll see here in a minute. So if we're looking at the actual recipe itself, we have two kind of main components to our composting recipe. So you've got the carbons and the nitrogens. Carbons are, again, carbohydrates for the decomposers, and they're considered browns. I will say this, that yes, you hear browns and greens all the time, but it doesn't have to do with anything to do with color. So the browns have to do with the actual, what are considered bulking agents, and the greens are your energy agents. And so with your greens, those are considered the nitrogen sources, and they are proteins that help build the strong bodies of the decomposers. So they provide that boost of energy that you need in order for that pile to get started there. So there's a balance or a recipe that you need between those items there, between your browns and your greens. And so let's look at a couple of those items of examples of what some of these items might be. So if you look at nitrogen, they tend to be more moist, more dense. And so some examples of this would be grass clippings that are fresh, meaning you just mowed the lawn. They have lots of moisture still left in them. Fruit and vegetable scraps, tea bags, weeds without seeds, fresh coffee grounds. And we'll go through what's the difference that between old coffee grounds. Some manures, as we said, no pet manures, but everything else within that list is great. And then some eggshells and some citrus is okay. The carbons are the dry, coarse materials. And think of this as like a bulking agent. So if you end up making something too liquidy, sometimes, for example, if you're making a recipe, you end up having to add either flour or maybe cornstarch in order to try to thicken it up. That's what the carbons do. They're the dry, coarse materials there. So those are like sawdust, dried leaves, grass, straw, cardboard, old coffee grounds, and twigs. So the difference between fresh and old coffee grounds is typically about 48 hours after brewing. So fresh coffee grounds have a bunch of nitrogen still in them after you've brewed them. But after 48 hours, that nitrogen actually volatilizes and then it ends up acting more as a carbon after those 48 hours. So that's the difference between fresh and old. So if you've brewed it and you used them in your system between the 40, day 1 and hour 1 and 48 hours, it would act as a nitrogen boost for your pile. If you've been sitting around in a container for a while, then they would act as a carbon after that 48 hours. Here ultimately is the recipe that you need. You need 1 green to 2 browns plus air and water to make compost. So if you look at the recipe here, you're like, so what does that mean in volume? So that could be let's say you had a 5-gallon bucket. It could be 1 bucket of green material to 2 buckets of brown material. 1 wheelbarrow of green compared to 2 wheelbarrows of brown. 1 dump truck to green to 2 dump trucks of brown. So again, it's based on volume plus air and water equals compost. So here's the recipe that you need in order to actually build an effective pile. We do have a video also on our YouTube for following up about greens and browns and also how to build a pile. So you can watch both of those also on our YouTube channel. All right, any new questions?
No new questions at this time.
Okay, great. Moving right along then. Okay, now we're time to build the pile. So when you're, let's say you have a bunch of brown material and you're ready to and a bunch of green material, you're ready to build your pile. The one thing you want to do with your browns is to break them up into smaller pieces, not super tiny, but you want to have some, let's say you've got these giant sticks or limbs from a tree, you want to break them up into manageable pieces that fit within your compost pile. So breaking them, bruising and bashing the things up into smaller pieces will help provide more surface area for the microbes to actually start processing those materials. The larger the item, the longer it's going to take to process. So if we help our microbes by actually breaking them into smaller pieces, the microbes have more surface area to actually process those items. The wow factor is you adding moisture and then turning that, which provides the oxygen. And when you do that, warmth is a byproduct, meaning warmth will actually happen. So you want to add your items, your recipe mix of browns and greens, add water and oxygen. And as you do that, heat will be produced after that initial mixing. And the goal of getting that air into it can be done in lots of different ways. There could be done with a pitchfork or a manure fork. You can add sticks or PVC pipe into your compost pile to get more oxygen into your pile. There is a thing called a composting turner, which is shown on your screen here. It has little blades at the bottom. And what happens is as you put them in, the blades collapse. And then when you're actually rotating and bringing the compost turner up towards you, the blades actually act like a blender and helps blend those items and helps mixing it. So again, you don't need to have it. You could do the same thing with, a pitchfork or a shovel, but it is helpful if you really want to truly mix up your pile better. These compost turners can help. Here's an example of a pile where it's a very large pile, and they didn't have the capacity to necessarily turn this. And so what they did is they inserted PVC pipe into the compost pile. And in this PVC pipe are a bunch of drilled holes here. And so what happens is the oxygen can flow now into the center of the pile. And these are kind of viewed as kind of like being a smokestack, so that they could actually get oxygen into the center of the pile so that the pile doesn't stall. The same principle was done traditionally at commercial facilities, where they used to, these were blow up tubes that they would pipe oxygen into, so that they would blow up into these long kind of cylindrical type of tubing, and then the oxygen would be forced through those holes through the tubing into the pile. Current technology is to actually have holes in the floor of a composting system. This is at a commercial facility, where now what happens is they pile the materials right up onto the floor of the facility, and then oxygen is forced through the floor into the piles that way. So there's lots of different ways of making sure that you get enough oxygen into your piles. We currently also have a video about how much to water. I would say the number one issue that typically compost piles have problems with is that they underwater their piles, meaning they don't have the consistency of a wrung out sponge. So if you think about a sponge, a wrung out sponge, that's how moist your pile should be. And traditionally, when we get folks that email us questions into our question answer clinic and they ask us to send pictures, you can tell that typically the edges of the bin are dried out, or also sometimes even the top layer of the compost pile is dried out. And when you hit it with water, the water just runs off and actually doesn't percolate down through the rest of the pile. So I would say the most issue is definitely underwatering. And then it also have a video about how do you know when the pile is finished. And that's kind of where we're ending up here on our last couple slides here. So if you make your pile, so here's a chart here that says that if we end up making a pile here, and our first temperature for this on day one was here, typically, let's say around 90 degrees, okay? If I was to turn the pile every 3 days, the temperature of that pile would shoot up here, all the way up here to about 160 degrees for at least, almost 20 days. And then from there, eventually it'll start to go down, and all of a sudden the temperatures will go down, which is what it's supposed to do, and then eventually level off and plateau, okay? If you don't want to turn your pile every 3 days, just know that your pile will still heat up. And let's say you turn it every 10 days, just know that what's going to happen is your pile will heat up, then it'll plateau a little bit, then you're going to have to mix it. It'll heat back up again, it'll plateau a little again, and then it keeps on going like that way for eventually then after 60, 80 days, eventually then it'll come down to a lower temperature, back to where it originally started. And then eventually zero. It'll be just normal air temperature. If you only turn your pile every 30 days, just know that again, it'll heat up, but then it plateaus, and then it takes, many, many months afterwards in order to get to that. So by turning it and adding that oxygen will really heat up the temperature. And know that when you're adding that pile, let's say you fill up the bin during that hot phase, this initial first few days, your pile will shrink in half naturally, and that's okay. That's what you want it to do. In the end, you'll know if it's compost when the pile no longer heats up when turned. It looks dark, sweet, and crumbly smelling. And after you look at it, and like here up at the top picture of the photo on the right, that's what finished compost will look like. At this point, that's where you want to be able to just let it sit before actually adding it to any of your vegetable beds or any of the other landscape beds. So curing is another part where most folks skip that part. So they all of a sudden realize, hey, my compost looks like this. I'm just going to directly now put this right onto my plants. For some of your more mature landscape plants, it won't necessarily hurt it. But if you were using vegetable starts, this compost hasn't been cured, which means the temperature is still relatively high and it could actually burn your vegetable plants. So you want to make sure that you're not putting uncured compost onto your vegetable plants, especially when they're new. You have either new starts or new seedlings. All in all, the entire process would take about 4 to 6 months from the date that you start it to the date which you actually can use it. Okay, so questions?
No questions at this time.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes left and we're going to go through the rest of this. So when you realize that, okay, I'm ready to actually use this, what's helpful is to actually have a screen. In this case, we used one that we have that we attach, we just sit it on top of our wheelbarrow. So we take our finished compost from our pile, we shovel it into the screen, and then what we do is we shake it, and then the finished compost falls to the bottom into the wheelbarrow. Anything that's bigger that hasn't been finished compost, like let's say there might be some cones or some larger sticks, that'll be left in the screen, and then we can use that in order to build a new pile. The screening itself is typically a 1/4 inch hardware cloth that you can get at any of our hardware stores. And then how do you use it? There's plenty of different ways. The one thing that I will say that science has changed over the years is before science used to say whenever you're planting something new to dig the hole and put the compost in the hole. That is no longer acceptable. The recommendation now is to put compost in the entire bed, because what happens is you want those roots to actually go out into the native soil, and you don't want the roots just to stay in that hole and think about, hey, this is a really great place for me to live. I don't want to move outside of that planting hole. So you want to make sure you incorporate the compost into the entire bed. You can put it on your lawns, put it on your shrubs and trees and berries, and also in your flower beds. And in our follow-up handout, there's a chart on how to use this as well. Just more items there. And then also, like I said, we're going to send you this publication on how to actually use it in your gardens. So what you should be doing right now with your compost pile, number one, stockpiling browns. Typically what happens as we go through, we got a lot of brown material that you might be cleaning up your yard. Stockpile that, meaning keep it in containers, because guaranteed this summer, you're going to have a ton of green material and you're going to need browns. So if you have brown material that you can stockpile right now, that'll help have that right balance, so that in the summertime, you won't end up having too much greens and not enough browns to balance your piles out. Because your greens are going to be all your spent flowers, all of your any materials where the material's already been used. Let's say you already harvested all your vegetables off that plant is still green. So you need a brown to balance it when you're in the process of composting. And traditionally we go through the seasons of not having one or the other, meaning we're lacking in greens or we're lacking in browns. So if you've got the browns now, stockpile them in some containers, and that way then you'll have them for your summer. We do have a chart in our handout that talks about all the different troubleshooting of what you might have. Feel free to email us directly at our question and answer clinic if you have any of these problems, and we can help walk you through trying to find solutions. But this chart is also in our follow-up materials, and it's also listed in the composting handout that's on our website. Right now, you might find some composting critters. They've spent the winter in your compost pile. Just know that this is the natural process of composting. Just so you know that, yeah, you want to try to, if you do have some of these critters in there, it's time now to evict them. Time to move out to the rest of the landscape. So mice and rats might be in your pile, slugs and snails right now. You might have had eggs in there that were laid as a way to, as a place for them to be warm over the winter time. Snakes, some can be in there also during this time frame. So it's time to move those along. Ants will only show up in a pile if your pile is too dry, and spiders are actually a good thing for your pile. They eat a lot of the other type of predator, or there are predators and eating other types of critters that you don't necessarily want in your pile. So I would keep the spiders. Ants, if you want to get rid of the ants, just water your pile and the ants will leave. Right now, this is what slug eggs look like. So if you're going through your leaves, slugs and snail, they look like gelatinous little pearls, kind of like tapioca pearls. And that's what you'll find in your piles right now. So if you see these, you want to remove them and don't put them out in the landscape, because now you've spread those slug eggs all over your yard. Okay, so we've just, let's see. Any other, questions, I don't think.
There are no questions lined up.
Okay, great. So we just have a couple minutes to go through the resources. So right now we have a couple follow-up resources. On our webpage, we have a bunch of links to our YouTube videos, our publications, the pro and con bin style handout, and also our in-person upcoming workshops. Like I said earlier, I would encourage you, if you have questions, to come on out to one of those in-person workshops where we can then walk you through any questions that you might have, or also help troubleshoot any of the other issues that you might be having with your own pile. Here's our workshop schedule. So currently right now we are on Zoom, but as you know, as you see from this one, starting in April, we have in-person ones at our demonstration gardens. We also have a public workshop at our Tumwater Library coming up in May, but the rest of them are all in the gardens until we end on Zoom again on October 2nd. So I would, again, encourage you to come out to any of these where you can get some hands-on experience with maybe answering, again, those troubleshooting questions that you might have. Here's the link to our backyard composting publication. This will be, it's on our website now. It will, and this is where the troubleshooting chart is also in this publication. And then it'll also be sent in our follow-up materials after this webinar for you as well. If you have a question and you've read the materials and you know still having questions about that, feel free to email us that or any other gardening question that you have. This is our general inbox, and the volunteers monitor this inbox and answer questions to you directly. It's helpful if you send pictures with it, especially if you have you know, a plant disease issue, then it's helpful to actually see the plant via a picture, since we can't actually come to your house to actually identify things. And so this is one way that you can just send us, again, your composting or gardening or recycling question directly to our inbox, and we can help answer those. We also have composting demonstrations in each of our gardens there as well. So on our webpage, we'll also have a list of when our gardens are open. The only one that is not open all the time is Dirtworks. It's only open when we are there. Closed Loop and Farmers Market have more public dawn to dusk set hours. So those are, it's a little bit easier to get to those during other times of the day, where Dirtworks is locked up and is only available when volunteers are present. And we have scheduled workshops for those specific times. All right, so that's what I would like to thank you for coming to our today's Lunch and Learn. Like I said, if there's any other questions, feel free to email us directly. And see if there's any other final questions we have in the inbox.
There are no questions, just some gratitude.
Okay, great. Well, great. Thank you again for coming to our Lunch and Learn today, and hopefully you'll see you out in some of our other Lunch and Learns, not only composting, but we'll have others that will be scheduled, other public workshops. Our library series also at the Tumwater Library has a bunch of different gardening topics. So again, check out our website for all the upcoming workshops. Thank you for participating for today.
Thank you. Goodbye.